everyone, it's Shelby Hartman, DoubleBlind's co-founder and editor-in-chief. Let's talk about Bicycle Day. Every year on April 19th, devoted psychonauts around the world celebrate Bicycle Day. Bicycle Day is basically the LSD version of 420 for weed. It's where psychedelic enthusiasts take acid or mushrooms or whatever substance they want to take, and they just have a good time together. But where does it come from, and what are we celebrating? The history of Bicycle Day begins in 1938, when chemist Albert Hofmann was working at the pharmaceutical department of Sandoz Laboratories in Basel, Switzerland, and he synthesized LSD from ergot, which is a fungus that commonly grows on grains of rye. So at the time, Hofmann had no idea that LSD had psychedelic effects. He had no idea what he was about to catalyze in our culture. He was just hoping to find a useful analeptic, which is a type of stimulant for treating respiratory and circulatory problems. So Hofmann was also the first person to ever drop acid, but his first trip was not on April 19th. It was actually 3 days earlier, on April 16th, in 1943. Hofmann decided to take another look at acid, and he started synthesizing a new batch. He was just finishing the process, and he began to feel something funny, and he decided to set his work aside for the day, which turned out to be a great decision. After going home, he kicked back on the couch, and he writes an account later saying, quote, "He sank into a not unpleasant, intoxicated-like condition characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination." He recalled that in his 1980 memoir called LSD, My Problem Child. He goes on to say, "I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes, with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors." Hofmann was convinced that the weird experience had something to do with the LSD. You think? He actually accidentally absorbed it through his skin while handling the substance in the lab. But he wanted to be sure. And so he did what any mad scientist would do. He decided to intentionally take LSD again. Hofmann later said that he took this risky step because that's what the new drug wanted. Quote, "LSD spoke to me," he told the New York Times in 2006. "He came to me and said, 'You must find me.' He told me, 'Don't give me to the pharmacologist. He won't find anything.'" So that might seem like a weird story coming from a respected scientist, but Hofmann didn't believe that science and spiritualism should be mutually exclusive. He also said in that New York Times interview, "When you study natural science and the miracles of creation, if you don't turn into a mystic, you are not a natural scientist." So 3 days later, after he had absorbed acid into his skin and had his first trip, this was on April 19th, he went back to his lab to drop acid on purpose. He had no idea how much to take. So the recommended dose for a first-time acid trip is between 100 and 200 micrograms, according to the Global Drug Survey. But there was no way for Hofmann to know that, since he was LSD's first and only guinea pig. He guessed that 250 micrograms would be a suitable dose, and he swallowed that dose at, fittingly enough, 4:20 p.m. So it didn't take Hofmann very long to realize, shiitake mushrooms! I'm about to experience something extremely intense. So Hofmann took his 250 micrograms of LSD and in pretty short order realized he was in for a very intense experience and did not want to be in his lab. So he asked his assistant for a ride home, but it was the middle of World War II. There were wartime restrictions that prohibited the use of cars on public roads, and so they had to bike instead. And that's where the name Bicycle Day comes from, is that Hofmann was tripping balls on LSD and riding his bicycle to try to get home to experience what was happening to him. The first Bicycle Day soon became pretty nightmarish. It was a difficult experience for Hofmann. He said, quote, "My surroundings had now transformed themselves in more terrifying ways. Everything in the room spun around, and the familiar objects and pieces of furniture assumed grotesque, threatening forms. They were in continuous motion, animated, as if driven by an inner restlessness. So at this point, Hofmann becomes convinced that he's poisoned himself, and that the best antidote is going to be milk. Lots and lots of milk. And there wasn't any in his house, so he asks his assistant to go get some milk from his neighbor. Now, these days, anyone who has LSD experience would have told him that was a terrible idea, but surprise, surprise, the milk only made things worse. He wrote, quote, "The lady next door, whom I scarcely recognized, brought the milk. In the course of the evening, I drank more than 2 liters, and she was no longer Mrs. R, but rather a malevolent, insidious witch with a colored mask." The neighbor wasn't the only thing that scared Hofmann, who felt like he had been possessed. He wrote, quote, "A demon had invaded me, had taken possession of my body, mind, and soul. I jumped up and down and screamed, trying to free myself from him, but then sank down again and lay helpless on the sofa. The substance with which I had wanted to experiment had vanquished me. It was the demon that scornfully triumphed over my will." Ooh, that sounds like a bad trip. Things spiraled from there as Hofmann began to worry about losing his sanity, which anyone would do if they had no context for what LSD is supposed to do or the fact that the experience does in fact end. He began to fear that he was basically losing his mind, he might die. He wrote, "I was seized by the dreadful fear of going insane. I was taken to another world, another place, another time. My body seemed to be without sensation, lifeless, strange. Was I dying? Was this the transition?" So the most challenging parts of the experience lasted until Hofmann's doctor arrived to check his vitals, which were completely normal. The only thing that seemed strange to the doctor was Hofmann's inability to speak coherently and his extremely dilated pupils, quote unquote. Sounds about right. After the doctor and the assistant helped Hofmann to bed, he finally chills out and begins to enjoy the trip. And he writes, "Now, little by little, I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colors and plays of shapes that persisted behind my closed eyes. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in colored fountains, rearranging and hybridizing themselves in constant flux. Every sound generated a vividly changing image with its own consistent form and color." That sounds amazing. The morning after, to Hofmann's surprise, he feels fantastic. And everything around him seems wonderful, which is very common after a classic psychedelic experience. It's something we now refer to as the afterglow effect. And he writes, "A sensation of well-being and renewed life flowed through me. Breakfast tasted delicious and gave me extraordinary pleasure. When I later walked out in the garden in which the sun shone now after a spring rain, everything glistened and sparkled in a fresh light. The world was as if newly created. All my senses vibrated in a condition of highest sensitivity which persisted the entire day." And that's really kind of the best case scenario after a trip, right? And it doesn't always happen that way, but oftentimes it does. And the most surprising thing to Hofmann wasn't the afterglow of the trip, but the absence of a hangover. He said, "Another surprising aspect of LSD was its ability to produce such a far-reaching, powerful state of inebriation without leaving a hangover. Quite the contrary, on the day after the LSD experience, I felt myself to be in excellent physical and mental condition." Hofmann, at that time, of course, had no idea what LSD was going to become, and he thought that it would have great value for researchers in pharmacology, neurology, psychiatry, but he didn't think that LSD would catch on as a recreational substance, especially after his nightmarish trip before, he had the kaleidoscopic visions and all the other things that happened towards the end. He couldn't imagine anyone dropping acid for fun, which is hilarious in retrospect. He said, quote, "I had no inkling that the new substance would also come to be used beyond medical science as an inebriant in the drug scene. Since my self-experiment had revealed LSD in its terrifying demonic aspect, the last thing I could have expected was that the substance could ever find application in anything approaching a pleasure drug." In other words, Hofmann never would have suspected that Bicycle Day would become an annual holiday celebrated by psychonauts around the world. The first official Bicycle Day was in 1985. Thomas B. Roberts, who was a professor of educational psychology at Northern Illinois University in DeKalb, specializing in coursework on consciousness, psychedelics, the transpersonal, and mind-body relation, decided to commemorate the first LSD trip by hosting a special celebration at his home on April 19th. And Roberts actually initially wanted the celebration to be on the 16th, which you may recall is the first time that Hofmann did LSD, although accidentally. And really the reason why it ended up being on the 19th was simply because the 16th was in the middle of the week and not a good day for a party, and the 19th that year was on a weekend. So he decided to celebrate the first intentional LSD exposure instead of the first exposure on the 16th. So basically the way that Bicycle Day spread around the world is that Roberts told his friends about it and it caught on, and it was a great idea in my personal opinion. And as mentioned before, people celebrate Bicycle Day all kinds of ways. They drop acid, of course. They do mushrooms, they hang out with their friends and smoke weed and just say, "Yay, it's Bicycle Day, aren't psychedelics cool?" There's been some events that have popped up as well, museum exhibitions and stuff like that, but really Bicycle Day, as psychedelics become more popular, is an opportunity for us to reflect on the progress of the quote-unquote psychedelic movement, not just beginning with Hofmann and the synthesis of LSD, but really going back thousands of years, because people have been taking psychoactive substances that produce, quote, classic psychedelic experiences, much like LSD, since the beginning of time. So that's the story of Bicycle Day, and if you're interested in learning more about the history of psychedelics, or how to use psychedelics, or how to grow mushrooms, DoubleBlind has so much free information on our website, as well as courses and webinars that you can sign up for, and you can check it all out at doubleblindmag.com.